You are listening to Paranormal Now on the Inception Radio Network. I'm Alan B. Smith, and join us as we traverse the cosmic highway of paranormal pit stops and tantalizing turnoffs. If you're a regular listener to IRN, we have an IRN smartphone app where you can listen live to the live stream from home, on the road, or from a greasy diner somewhere off a dusty road. The map app also allows you to chat with other listeners, provides show lineups and other information and tools. If you're just finding us, please like the Paranormal Now Facebook page, which is at Paranormal Now Radio, or on Instagram at Paranormal Now. And a brief reminder, if you listen to RNN's 24/7 a lot, the 24/7 stream, there are different ways for you to listen. So you can tune in via Live 365, Stitcher Radio, Nobex Radio, TuneIn, iTunes Radio, Streama, Shoutcast, Winamp, WinMedia Radio, QuickTime, and IRN Roku channel as well. And if you don't have access to a computer or smartphone and you're panicking and you need your paranormal fix, you can call from your landline or cell phone to listen in for free at 401-283-6700. Now, this is a podcast for those of you who are just tuning in. This is not a live show, so if you try to call in, I'm sorry, but we are not here. And although we are a broadcast on a regular scheduled basis, I want you to know that there are weeks where we are not there. You may be a holiday weekend. It may be something going on in my life personally, and we might have to fill it in with a repeat episode. So for those of you who have some concerns about that, those are some explanations for the skipped weekends on occasion. I'm very excited about tonight's guest. You probably know her. If not, I'm sure that you've heard of her. Her name is Dr. Rita Louise. She is the best-selling author and the host of Just Energy Radio and the founder of the Institute of Applied Energetics. She is the author of the books The E.T. Chronicles, What Myth and Legend Has to Say About Human Origin, Avoiding the Cosmic 2x4, Dark Angels, An Insider's Guide to Ghosts, Spirits and Attached Entities, and the Power Within, as well as hundreds of articles that have been published worldwide. She is the producer of a number of videos whose titles include Holy Deception, Icon, Destructing the Archetypes of the Ancients, The Truth About the Nephilim, and Deceit, Lies, and Deception, The Reptilian Agenda. Dr. Rita has appeared on radio and television and has spoken at conferences covering topics such as health and healing, ghosts, intuition, ancient mysteries, and the paranormal, which is what we do here all the time. Rita, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Alan. I'm looking forward to hanging out with you and the rest of the IRN family.
Yes,
it's been a while since I've been here or on IRN, so yay.
Yeah, and so how long ago did you start on IRN with your own show?
I don't remember, but I was with them for quite a while. So, and then I decided to start doing video interviews, and so I decided I needed to go ahead and move on, and that's been about 2 years.
Okay.
So.
And how have the 2 years gone off air? Do you miss it?
Well, I mean, I'm still doing interviews. I'm still talking with people, except it's video. And so, you have to have good hair and makeup.
Yeah, you have no idea what I look like right now.
While the person's talking and, drink water and do all kinds of weird stuff while you have your guest on air because it kind of gives you away.
Right, you can't clear the wax out of your ear on the live video interview. All right.
No.
So we're doing an actual interview, and you can do any of those things that we just covered if you want, because no one will know. And to start off, I wanted to ask you, with all the broad ranges of topics that you cover, how did you get caught up with the research into aliens, ancient alien history? Because it seems to me you had a very homeopathic path.
Great question. So in my early life, I had two loves. My first was the study of archaeology and anthropology. where I pretty much read my way through the books at the library, to the chagrin of the nuns at the Catholic school I went to. And I was a huge proponent of the theory of evolution. My second love that came on the heels of it was the study of psychic phenomena, ESP, human potential, human development, which I have been actively involved in. I mean, what I do is I work as a medical intuitive, professional psychic, working with clients around the world. Mm-hmm. And, and so studied that for a very long time, worked and still work professionally doing that. And then when it was the 2012 thing that had come up, and this was probably about 2009, and I was watching a show about 2012, the world was going to end December 21st, 2012, and they were talking about the Mayan prophecy, and then they made these comments about, well, they talk about the same concept in Hindu cosmology and Egyptian, and they were kind of rattled off some other things, which got my little archaeology mind going. Because even when I was studying things like the Tarot, I found that I couldn't even memorize them, but I got really interested in studying the esoteric and the philosophical and the ancient history, and when did this come into being, and this whole historical aspect to it. So the history part never really left. Mm-hmm. But in that studying, well, I realized that what they were talking about on TV was kind of hooey, but it caused me to start looking at some articles that were talking about mythology, which set me off on this whole giant tangent and down a huge rabbit hole. And so when I sit there and actually, if you listen to me talk, I very rarely use the word alien. Now, I might say and lump myself into the ancient alien category to put myself somewhere, but I rarely use the word alien because I talk about the gods, because that's how they talk about them in mythology. And
that's
so
how you view them.
And my approach to them is from the belief system of the people who told these stories. They were the gods, or the sky people, or the sky heroes, or those that came from the heavens, which we in the Americas or the Western world call gods. And so my focus really isn't on contemporary ufology, although I have a book that I started, but I'm finishing up this other book right now, that is going to look at the mythological record for stories that you find that parallel contemporary UFO sightings and contemporary abduction scenarios. So there's going to be a little bit of a tie in my vocabulary. But when I started, because I really started doing research for the ET Chronicles book, and went in with a very open mind. I mean, are we talking about, are these just these stories? What is it? And I let the stories tell their story. And by the time I got doing my research and I sat down to actually write the book, there was no way to write the book without throwing the ancient alien idea on the table up front and center, which I do once. And then I leave it alone.
Just deal with it right off the bat. Okay.
Because there was no way to write it without looking at it from that perspective or putting that on the table. And the other things that I recognized early on in writing was that I wasn't writing this book for the entire world. I was writing this book for people in the Western world, because if you go to India, they believe that these deities live in the sky and they interact with humanity. Native Americans, same thing. You go to cultures around the world and their viewpoint of quote unquote God is not ours.
Well, I guess it's like, if you were maybe a researcher from another country and another culture, and you looked at the Judean Bible, then you would see that in the same light, right? You would say, oh, those people believe that stuff is 100% real as it is. But as a researcher, this is how I'm reading it.
Well, I mean, we sit there and look at the mythological record that these people were just, making stuff up and writing it down and telling, ghost stories about these magnificent creatures and characters that pervade myth. And your comment makes me go, well, I wonder how people that are Hindu or are Buddhist look at our notion of Christianity, because it's the same thing. We have an invisible God. And this whole notion of Jesus, and which I'm not even going to get into that powder keg. It's kind of like, well, why should they think that our God is real? I mean, we have this belief that our God is real, but their gods are made up. Mm-hmm. Well, what's with that?
Well, and I don't mean to detract from the topic, because we talked about spending some time on the mythology and the gods and extraterrestrials, quote extraterrestrials. But you had that post on Facebook recently that really did get myself and a lot of other people thinking, and posing this question of, who was this God in the first place? And was this God a culmination of different gods? Because you have a God who we all say, if you're from the Christian, raised or Judean raised, or Muslim raised, you say, well, God is this God of passion, of compassion and love, and then yet he had done all these destructive and very vicious things, tempting someone to kill their own son, and just wiping people off the face of the earth, the firstborn, things like that. It's very, very scary if you didn't know that was God, and I was just telling you a mythological story from another culture. You would say, oh gosh, what a ruthless God. So it's really, people do, I mean, obviously people reconcile that in some way or another. But myself, having been raised Catholic and no longer Catholic, that was one of the main concerns I had reading scripture as I was growing up. It just didn't jive with me the way the church wanted it to.
Well, and it's interesting because one of the things that you find when you start surveying the religions or the philosophical traditions of cultures from around the world, when you look at indigenous cultures, or when you... All right, I need to say this correctly. Culture or traditions that come from an Abrahamic base, so from Abraham. So Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all are offshoots of Abraham and Isaac and that whole thing as the base character. And Abraham was monotheistic. He believed in one God. But when you step outside of that tradition, of Abrahamic traditions, every culture believes in multiple gods. But what's interesting is that the majority, or at least what I have found, the majority of the cultures believe in what I'm going to term a supreme God, the God who is the originator of the universe and the world and the things that we see in it. And then there are these other gods that maybe could be more likened to heroes or these people that they interacted with, and we call them gods. And in their cosmology, they were powerful and they had abilities that were beyond their level of understanding, but they weren't this omnipotent creator that we associate with God of the Bible. With that said, I'll just keep going. With that said, one of the things that I had posted on that one thread you were mentioning was that, how do I want to phrase this? In these other cultures, they have a pantheon of gods. And so when the Bible, this is my opinion, but when the Bible was written, they couldn't have this pantheon of gods anymore They had, because now there's only one God. But how do you tell? Actually, I'm even going to back up. When you look at mythology from around the world, what you find is a very consistent story told by one culture to the next. And you could literally pick bullet points throughout the storyline and find those bullet points in cultures around the world. The concept of a golden age, the flood we ascribe to Noah, the formation of the sun, moon, and stars. I mean, and they all appear in a certain order. Some cultures have more details. The same one might omit a story. And so you can kind of fill this grid in with different cultural narratives, including the stories you find in the Bible. Now, you would think that the Bible would have totally different stories because we're talking about a different God, but we're not. But what I discovered was you can't talk about the war between Zeus and Kronos and the Titans, and you can't talk about Enlil raping this other god. I mean, you can't tell these stories if there's only one God, because God can't fight against himself. God can't have relations with himself. He can't have children. Well, I guess he did, but but you see what I'm saying? It's like, so all of those stories that make up the bulk of the ancient myths, the creation narratives, got deleted. They just flat got deleted. And what you find are aspects of these stories all combined into one person. So God ends up seeming kind of schizophrenic, because you have this kind and benevolent God, which is usually associated with Enlil, or the fertility gods, the ones that are represented by half man, half snake, and Enlil, who is the sky god, who's very authoritarian and judgmental, which many people assume is the God on high. And so those two personalities kind of got compressed into one person, so they didn't have to get rid of the stories, if that made sense.
No, that makes sense. And if you're having cultures that are trying to come together to be a stronger, bigger culture, as it were, especially if you're in a time of warring tribes, then you would have to sort of reconcile each other's religions and bring them into the fold, into one another. I remember also hearing that one of the earliest incarnations of the Torah, that there was a male god and a female god. So before they had whittled it down to one god, there were two main deities.
And actually, I've never heard that. So that's kind of interesting. But it's very consistent with what you find in a lot of the mythic record, is that there are these dual deities. Sometimes they are referred to as being hermaphroditic, where there's Fuxi and Mua, who are they're serpents, but it's two heads on one intertwining serpent body. And so you find this dual-headed, hermaphroditic-like, because it's male and female, godhood in Sumerian culture. You actually find it quite a bit in South America as well. And so I think it's really interesting that it was in a very early version of the Torah. Again, I haven't seen that, but if I had a reference, I would quote from it.
Yeah, I mean, I should bite my lip on that. I don't know if there was actual Torah written, but I do know that it was a goddess. Her name was something like Asherah, and she was considered the god, the mother. And this was interesting because I also recently watched your Icon documentary, and you spent a lot of time discussing the early goddess figurines, if I will. And it seems to me that mother goddess depiction had been dwindled over history. like there was a time where this goddess, whether it was really a female goddess from another planet coming down here, or what, little by little we stopped venerating these goddesses, and I wonder, what do you think? Why do you think that has dwindled over the past 10,000 years or so?
Yeah, and that would be pretty much the date I would put on it, 10 to 12,000 years. Okay, so this is my cop-out. So it is on my list. I am working on a timeline of intervention, alien intervention. And one of the things that's on my list that I haven't really researched fully yet is if I can find events or a reason why culture shifted from a matriarchal rule to a patriarchal rule. And I don't know yet, but I am sure I will find something.
So what's the timeline that you're speaking of?
So in the book that I'm working on now, it delves into the formation of culture, I guess would be the best way of saying it. And it talks about why do we do the things that we do? And it looks at ancient and indigenous cultures and the things that we do, which include ceremony and ritual and body modifications and worshiping in certain ways. And so what I talk about, because I put out in this book that, the gods were the ones, because you look at the mythic record and the gods are the ones who teach humanity everything, basically. And try to put a timeline to that with their education. And so what I'm working on right now is, okay, in my book, E.T. Chronicles, I work at dating the flood. And so we have 3 different dates or 4 different dates. There's the 2400 BC date. There's the 6000 BC date, which are, really tied to the Bible record. There's the current one that is floating around, which is the 11,500 BC date. But if you look at ancient sources, one of the things that they talk about, and they put the date at somewhere between 30 and 40,000 years ago, with 34,000 being about the average date of when this flood occurred. And so starting at that date, I looked for, because if there was a flood, if we had this major event, when do you see things turn around, or where do you see these blips in history? Like when 5,000 BC, we see the historic rise of civilization. So that is a blip. It went from, early farmers into this thing. And so that's what I looked for. And what I found was 40,000 years ago, we had the creative explosion. We had the cave paintings in France. We have the beginning of weaving of textiles. Even though they don't have textile evidence, they have evidence that they were spinning flax fibers. And so there were all of
the creative explosion was literally this time period where people started making things, painting.
Right. Exactly.
Okay.
There's another little blip that happens around 25,000 years ago. It's where we find the Venus figures coming into play. Weaponry advanced at that point in time. Not a major blip. But what happens after each of these blips is big thing of activity and then nothing. And then another big thing of activity and then nothing. 10,000 years ago, like around the time of after the flood, if the flood was 11,500 years ago, we have the rise of agriculture. We also find that it's when we domesticated animals. We started forming small villages, and so there is this, and when we started domesticating plants, it wasn't just that we domesticated wheat in the Middle East. It was the wheat got domesticated in the Middle East. Rice was domesticated in China. And corn was domesticated in the Americas, which they still can't figure out how the heck they did it. So that's in the new book. You know, and the same thing with domesticating animals. This is one of my favorite lines to share. So between 8500 BC to about 2500 BC, every animal that has been domesticated was domesticated. Alan, do you know how many animals in our rise of education and technology have been domesticated since 2500 BC?
2?
None.
Jeez.
0. So how did they know how to do it? And we don't have a clue. We've had the same amount of time. We've had the same amount of time.
What? So your line of thought here is that there was a shared information?
Or we weren't the ones that domesticated them.
I see. Okay.
I mean, all right. So,
they're
here's another
passed down
line
to us, or we just it was taught to us, or it was passed down and inherited by.
Well, I'm going to use an example out of the agricultural domestication because there's not really glaring evidence in animal domestication, but I think this will give you the point.
Okay.
So 30,000 years ago, there was a miraculous event. I love that. It was a miraculous event that happened in the plant kingdom, and a form of, and I get these backwards, emmer wheat mated with a form of goat grass, and its byproduct was elkhorn wheat. Maybe it's backwards, but anyway. And so usually in nature, if two different species mate, so if you have a zebra and a horse that mate, the offspring are infertile because it's just how it works. You know, or if you take a horse and a donkey and they make a mule, they're infertile. That's just how it works. But somehow, miraculously, this grain that crossbred produced viable offspring. And the part that I think is even better is that it produced viable offspring and somehow survived and spread. Okay, so now we have this inkhorn wheat that is hanging around, and inkhorn wheat has more gluten, and so it allowed the very early bread makers to make more of a risen bread versus kind of like a pita bread. Okay, so there was definitely a benefit from this new kind of grain. So 30,000 years goes by. Well, then 10,000 years ago, we had another miraculous event that happened. And that inkhorn wheat mated with another form of goat grass and made it into what we find as modern wheat today that was also reproducible. Well, and scientists don't understand how those two genetic anomalies occurred. They don't understand it. They try to reproduce it in the lab. And in this one article, basically they said, well, we have to mix it with a bunch of chemicals, and we have to do this and this in order to get that viable offspring to happen.
Yeah, or like genetic splicing or something like that.
Oops. Did you just say that out loud?
I did.
No, it was a miracle of nature.
It just slipped out.
I mean, that's what they want us to believe. And so I think a similar thing happened in the domestication of animals, is that they did something to make them be that way, and then they stopped. And then it was up to us, and we're stupid. So,
well, you know what? We're coming up on the break, so we'll talk about more miraculous happenings in our history in just a couple of minutes. I'm speaking with Dr. Rita Louise, and this is going to be one heck of a ride tonight. So hang in there. This is Alan B. Smith for the Inception Radio Network. We're going to dig down deep into our history, extraterrestrials, aka gods. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Paranormal Now. I'm your host, Alan B. Smith. I'm talking to Dr. Rita Louise, and we are discussing all things mysterious and miraculous. And taking us out of the break was Something Happened on the Way to Heaven by Phil Collins, one of my favorites. So, Dr. Rita Louise, we were speaking about this sort of sudden percolation of a breed of wheat that scientists can't explain how it came to be, other than their own attempts at chemically or scientifically intervening to make it so. So that leaves us hanging. What do you think caused this? Well,
I think that it was genetically engineered. I don't think that. It's kind of a two-part process. So we have the genetic miracle that happened. But then there's the part. Okay, so if I have two plants that cross-pollinate, that produce seeds, what is the likelihood that one plant of seeds is going to, as I've said in my writing, create a revolution, that it would spread so far that early hunter-gatherers, because we're talking about 30,000 years ago, sure, recognized that this grain was different and started to save it or do something with it. It's just one of those things that I end up reading going, yeah, right. I find it interesting because there's so much stuff that you read about that comes from scientists, where they say, well, we really don't know how that happened, or wow, that occurred in a really short period of time, or they're even dumbfounded, and
they couldn't use just like splicing, where where you kind of slit a little cut into a tree, and then you take the branch of the tree, and then you wrap it, and the way they would sort of blend apple trees. There was no known mechanism, natural way for doing that, right?
Not at that point in time. They didn't even have agriculture at that point in time.
Yeah, interesting. I remember hearing an interview recently with Neil deGrasse Tyson, and he was making the argument for genetically modified, essentially, saying that, well, human beings have spliced, different sort of plants together, for a long time. So us going in and just putting a new genetic gene or mixing genes in a lab is no different than a farmer who learned how to do it from his dad, crossing two different breeds of apple tree or a peach with a plum tree. And I really took offense to that, because these are scientists, and I thought that's really, I feel like, offensive to our own understanding of how science and genetics works, because you can't put a spider into a little cut bark of an apple tree and wrap it up, and then the apple tree is going to have spider genes, and you're going to have some sort of mutated super apple plant. It's not going to happen. You have to physically force those genes into the genes of the apple in a lab. So it seems to me that it's on a somewhat similar par to get to what you're speaking of. For ancients to have developed what they did then, it seems almost parallel to what we have to do in order to, splice a spider into a plant. Maybe I'm way off, but that's kind of
But
parallel.
that's if our ancestors actually did it.
If they actually did it, right.
I think it's pretty simplistic, because if you take a Macintosh and a Granny Smith, they're both species of apples. And so there should be the ability to cross-pollinate and produce McGrannies or something, that's a possibility. But if you take a lion and a tiger, they're two different species, and if you get them to mate, it would be like, actually a better example would be, and this is kind of nasty, but if you took a human and a gorilla or a chimpanzee and you put them together, because our DNA is 98% the same, and have an expectation that we would create a ape man offspring. Wouldn't happen.
No. But who do you think? Who are these gods? Who did this?
Well, when you start reading the mythic record, one of the things that you find out is that The gods take on many shapes and forms. Some of them are described as being Caucasian with long flowing hair. Some of them are described as being half man, half serpent. There are some that are described as being giants, as tall as trees and as big as mountains. There are some that are described as dwarfs. I mean, so we find this variety of descriptions when we talk about the god pantheon. And when you look at like Indian cosmology, they describe some of the gods as having, 50 heads and 50 arms, or Indra had 4 heads and 4 arms, 6 heads and 4 arms. He had a bunch of heads and arms, or faces. And that's just part of their belief system. We have one Indian god that his head was chopped off, and so he took the head of an elephant to use. And so they aren't always represented or talked about and described as being necessarily even humanoid. I mean, I guess they're humanoid because they have a head and arms and legs, but not human in the way that we think we were created in his image, kind of human. The gods are always described as not living on the earth. They're described as living in the sky. They're described as living deep within the earth or underneath the earth's waters. They're described as flying through the air on fiery chariots. There's so much information that when you read it, it doesn't correlate with this omnipotent God that we've all been told is the one we're supposed to believe in, which is why I really had to focus that this is to the Western world, because in India, they believe that. They believe that Rama flew on a Vimana after he killed the demon god of Lanka, who was a giant and had multiple heads and had a Vimana. They believe that. That's part of their religion.
Sure, and we were just watching the movie Wonder Woman. I don't know if you saw it, but I couldn't help notice the parallel between Ares and Lucifer. Ares rebelling against Zeus's creation, and then you have Lucifer rebelling against God's creation, because they're both angry that he created, these really messed up beings, with lots of problems and psychological issues, and I thought, that's just another example, and I don't know which came first. Do you? Were the Greeks earlier than, or not so much? Because I guess if it came from a sort of Sumerian timeline origin, then I guess the Greeks came later. What do you think?
Yeah, the Greeks were definitely later. The Greeks were, Alexander the Great, who was Greek, was 333 BC, and then the Romans followed right behind them.
But they probably, did they not get some of the myths from, origins of Mesopotamians and the Sumerians ultimately?
But here's the interesting thing. You find parallel myths in Australia, which was populated 60,000 years ago. And you find parallel myths in the Americas, which was populated somewhere, 13,000 plus years ago, long before the Sumerians. So where did those stories come from? One of the things that I contend is that when you talk about this pantheon of gods, that really we're just talking about one group of gods. We're talking about a specific fertility god. We're talking about a specific sky god who would be like Enki. But it's Enki or Zeus or Quetzalcoatl. You know what I mean? They have different names in different cultures, but we're talking about the same person because the iconography, the attributes associated with that individual are all the same.
They're all the same, and there are some overlapping as well. So, one figure in one culture might encompass certain 2 or 3 attributes that overlap with another figure from another culture. I remember Actually, if you could actually explain the sun symbol, the winged sun symbol, and I think that's a really good way, because I think people can actually visualize that in their head. They've seen probably enough imagery. So what are the parallels there between all the different cultures?
Okay. Okay, I'm gonna have to find that file. Okay, in my brain that is. Okay, so in Egypt, I think people are familiar with the image of the winged disc. So there is the circle of the sun, and it has two big, kind of eagle-looking wings coming off the sides. Okay, but Sumerian culture preceded Egyptian culture, so I have to but we'll start with that visual. And so in Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian culture, they have their supreme deity. In Akkadian it was Shamash. But anyway, so they have this imagery of the god, so it's kind of like the upper half of the god sitting inside the circle with these wings coming off of it, which many people correlate to he's some kind of a spaceship. And so, and coming off of that are these different rays, 8 rays. And so when in other images, if there was a circle that had these 8 rays coming off of it, it was the implication that the power and the energy of God was with you or was with that person. So with that kind of base knowledge, so we have a circle with these rays coming off of it with the wings, is the representation of the power of God being with you. But now we go back to the Egyptians and we have this circle with these wings coming off it. It doesn't have the rays, but again, it's kind of like that Excel spreadsheet. You have some stuff carried here, some stuff carried there. Taken as a whole, you get a big picture, but sometimes details might drop off. But then you come to the Americas and you have images of the supreme god, Viracocha, and many times it is the image of a man holding 2 serpents, but around his head is like a halo of rays. Now, some of the rays are actually serpents. There are 7 serpents represented, and then there are 8 points represented. And so, but that is also the representation of the god. So, we get that same knowledge. And you find it in New Mexico, where they have, on the New Mexico flag, it's a big circle, and then it has, rays kind of coming out the 2 sides. Yeah. I mean, all you have to do is really start looking for that basic image, and you start seeing it everywhere. And one of the things that I put in my movie icon, Deconstructing the Archetypes of the Ancients, when I looked at that, is perhaps the notion of a halo. So when we look at Christian art, if it's a saint or if it's Jesus, there's always that halo going around the head of the holy person or the high religious person. If the utilization of the halo actually goes back to those images of An or Shamash in his winged disc back to Sumerian times, which represented the power of God in these individuals, because that's what holy people are. God works through them. So Are we still carrying that same iconography forward to this day?
And I think that you make the argument then that these aren't just natural psychological, permutations of the human mind in artistic form, that to say that these different cultures, disparate cultures around the world, didn't just naturally come out with these similar symbols and gods and figures around the same period of time on their own because it's natural, but because there was another outside force or impetus causing this.
Correct. that they were all talking about and representing the same thing. Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, during the break, we were talking about how you should be on Ancient Aliens, and and I agree, and I think you would be great. But I wonder, do you think you would offer them a little bit of a challenge with some of your interpretations of what the God or ET is? Or would it just be
I've heard them say some really weird stuff, you know? And I can tone it down a little bit. You know, I mean, I
don't think you
joke
should
around.
ever.
I tell people, I joke around and tell people that I'm the person that finds the driest, most boring book sitting on your library shelf and reads it, and then turns around and reiterates it in usable form. Mm-hmm. You know, I think, you know, kind of talk about Ancient Aliens, but from what I understand, they give you kind of an idea of what they want to talk to you about. You know, so you can go and kind of pull your thoughts together. Well, you know, if they don't want me to go too far out there, even though, and I don't think my thoughts are really that far out there. I think that when I put out a statement, I either have material to back it up and give it credibility. I mean, I really don't just make something up. And if I do kind of make something up, I'm usually very clear that, well, I don't know about this, but this is kind of what I think. You know, in my book, E.T. Chronicles, I'll share this story with you. It talks about these different periods of time, you know, the Golden Age, the Silver Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age. But in some cultures, there are actually 5 cycles. So in the Mayan calendar, you know, they talked about the 5 cycles. Mm-hmm. Well, I had a really hard time correlating how some could have 4 and some could have 5. But I finally figured it out. Because in many of these cultures, the ones that have 5, it's the second cycle that's the Golden Age, not the first cycle. And so the first cycle talks about this planet, or you know, where the gods lived, and it was a semi-dark earth, and they talk about darkness, and you find this very consistent in cultures that have this first unnamed age. And then there was a destruction event that occurred, and the inference was they went to somewhere else and they created a new world and brought on the Golden Age. So I was like, okay, so if coming to Earth and populating Earth set off the Golden Age, well, then where were they before? I thought that was a pretty valid question. Mm-hmm. So just kind of, you know, all right, I did pull this one out of my butt. Okay, and I freely admit it. I said, well, maybe they went to Mars first. You know, you got those faces on Mars and the pyramid structures at Cydonia, and I'm like, well, let me kind of look at it.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's nothing wrong with speculation and hypothesis. I mean, you have to start somewhere.
Well, what was interesting was that there was a period of time in the development of Mars that scientists have identified that if there was life going to form on Mars, it would have been during the Noachian era. Well, the Noachian era was 4.2 billion years ago, which happened to fit perfectly into my timeline. And then the atmosphere on Mars got destroyed. Well, if, you know, there was this big destruction in this semi-dark world and they had to flee, well, doesn't even the story sound like it fits? So I put it in. I'm like, you know, people can hate me for it. I don't care. It worked.
And sometimes you might get lucky and it does work out. Yeah. But it did make me think, and I'm not knocking you on this at all, but it made me think about Terrence McKenna. He had, in his younger years, co-written a book with his brother, and I think it was Time Wave Zero. And this was the first thing that actually, you had mentioned it earlier, that got me into 2012 and became fascinated because his Time Wave Zero ended, like the history based on some algorithm that he and his brother created, ended on 2012. So
really?
Yeah, and this was just by coincidence, and this was in the '70s, late '70s, I think, when he wrote the book. Um, and unfortunately, Terrence McKenna passed away before he could see the time come. But it thought, wow, the Mayan calendar is ending in 2012. This time wave zero is ending on 2012, and there was one other theory for a timeline. I'm drawing a blank now, but the point is, I thought, oh my gosh, that can't be a coincidence. This is crazy. So I really became fascinated with it, and of course, 2012 has come and passed. So it's not to say that the work was bad. Maybe there was something that happened. Maybe there really was a shift. Because I could tell you right now, I feel like America's in a major shift, and the world is with us on that. So I'm open. I think that what you're saying is a really good place to start, and it'd be interesting to see where you take it from here. So let me ask you. Oh no, go ahead, Rita.
Well, I mean, I was a huge Mayan calendar December 21st, 2012 skeptic because I did not find enough evidence to support the date, which I won't go into that whole thing. But there was something that was very interesting that did come out of that in my research. They talked about that cycle, and please forgive me for not. It was 3,100 and 400 and some odd year, whatever. I don't remember what the number was from the beginning of the cycle to the end of the cycle, but it was 3,100 years. Well, what was interesting was that there were new beginnings that happened in Indian cosmology as well as in Jewish cosmology that date to around that same period. And so we had the beginning of the new cycle in the Mayan calendar. We had the day that Krishna left the earth and brought on the Kali Yuga, which was 3,400 and right in that same period. And the Jewish calendar begins at like 3,700 and something, and then you have to take into consideration, we've changed our calendar 50 times, and, what is the real date if we were going back to the old date? But it seems like there was something that happened in that time period. What it is, I don't know. I couldn't find anything to support it other than all three of them talk about a new beginning, a new phase of the cycle. So, okay. What was your question?
Yeah. No, that was good. In this beginning, you were speaking about 5 cycles. In that beginning cycle, or even today, these demi-gods or pre-human gods or, demigods of a greater god, whatever they are, do they come here in flying saucers? Do they come here in spaceships?
Okay. I mean, we've briefly mentioned the fire chariot. Those are typically identified as how the gods came from the heavens down to the earth. That was their mode of transportation. In Norse cosmology, they have Bifrost, which if anybody's seen Thor, it's kind of like the they're going across that shiny bridge because it's often reflected or referred to as the Rainbow Bridge. But then, he goes into that kind of wormhole transporter thing that leaves him on the earth, so that was kind of their mode of transportation. But what's interesting, in the Mahabharata, it talks about this thing, the word escapes me. But anyway, it talks about the homes of 5 of the major gods. And when they describe these homes, which kind of sounds like Olympus, not Mount Olympus, but Olympus. But it was a place where hundreds of thousands of people could live, and they all had different homes in there, and some were made of gold, and some were made of silver, and some were made of different kinds of metal, depending on their rank and status. They had gardens, they had all of these things in these homes of the gods. Now, these homes of the gods could travel anywhere they wanted with just a thought. They could fly through the skies, they could go under the water. The smallest one, based on my conversion of the measurement, was something like 300 by 500 miles.
Whoa.
That was the smallest one. It was huge. Okay, now...
I mean, these are mothership size.
They're mothership size. And so, they use these fiery chariots to go from heaven or Olympus. I mean, because what is heaven? Heaven is where God lives, right?
True, yeah.
Well, where do the gods live? They live in that mothership that's circling the earth, and they're taking their little shuttlecraft down to the earth.
Have you heard of a P-Funk Parliament from the 70s?
I don't think so. No.
Okay, I'm gonna have to send you one of their songs about talking about the mothership. Actually, you know what? I'll probably use that as a bumper music in the next break coming up. So basically, you're saying it's not just one sort of mono tribe of extraterrestrials, or what are they? We have a variety of different extraterrestrials using different modes of transportation. So okay, here we are, these beings on this planet. We have different races coming down here from who knows where. And do they know each other? I mean, how do they get here and they war against each other because it's like, oops, no, this is my territory now. The humans are my pets.
Pretty much. Yeah. Pretty much. I mean, if you think about, and I'll use Greek cosmology, actually, when... Dr. Rita
Louise, hold it right there. We're coming up to the second break.
Let's take a break.
Yep, okay. And we'll pick it up when we get back. This is Alan B. Smith for Paranormal Now on the Inception Radio Network, and I'm speaking with Dr. Rita Louise. Fantastic conversation. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. And welcome back to Paranormal Now. I'm your host, Alan B. Smith, on the Inception Radio Network. My guest tonight is Dr. Rita Louise, and taking us out of the break was We Want the Funk by Parliament. All right, so we were speaking of extraterrestrials, ancient aliens, as it were. But Dr. Rita Louise has a different perspective on it, and I do appreciate that. And where we had left it off in the break, in particular, we were speaking about some ancient Greek mythology. So Rita, I don't know if you want to pick it up from there and take us away.
Sure. And so I'm going to use the Greek mythology as kind of the narrative, because I think people are familiar with the names involved. But the way that the story, okay, so this is me, and I will say that this is me making an interpretation of the story that we find. But the original progenitor gods that came to, I'll say, this solar system were gods like Uranus and Gaia. And according to their narrative, they had a number of children, the Titans and the Cyclopses and the Herkimers. I can never say that word right. And so Uranus was afraid of the Titans, and so he put them into Tartarus. But the youngest son, Kronos, wasn't put in Tartarus, and so Gaia gave him a adamantium sickle, which he used to castrate his father. Well, so Uranus is tied to that dual god type concept. All of the progenitor gods, when you look at early cosmology, are all that dual hermaphroditic type concept. Kronos was a fertility god. So the iconography tied to the fertility gods are the half man, half serpent, some kind of aquatic reptilian type being. So Kronos is the one who was considered a rebel and escaped. It is my belief that Uranus and Gaia and the original progenitor gods, a group of 8, actually settled onto Mars first, or at least that's kind of my thought. But then they had the late heavy bombardment that occurred about 3.8 billion years ago, which destroyed the atmosphere. So there's this war that happens. Kronos escapes, and he sets up shop on the Earth, which started the Golden Age in many cultures around the world, and everything was very fertile, and all of this great stuff was going on. So he's here hanging around for eons, and then we have his son, Zeus, who is portrayed in cosmology as being Caucasian with long flowing hair, usurps the throne. There is the war between, Zeus and Titans, and Zeus wins. And we find this consistent story of warring that happens, in Greek cosmology, it talks about it was their child, but when you look at how they're described, it seems almost impossible that their children could look that way. But if you kind of put a different twist on it and talk about different factions of aliens, kind of like the Federation, it had the Ferengi in charge at one point in time, and now the Klingons are in charge, and now the Federation came in and took control of this planet. It kind of makes more sense. And one of the things that you were mentioning a little bit earlier about, Ares being kind of tied to the devil and the war between them. But what's interesting is that, using Zeus again, Zeus was a sky god. His home, where heaven is in the sky. Kronos was a fertility god, and his home was in the water. And so, or in the earth, down there. I like to say it that way. It was down there, and he was kind of serpent-like. And so when we look at contemporary Christianity or Abrahamic traditions, we have this war between God and Lucifer, where God is up there and Lucifer, who is evil, is down there because he lost the war. So, they have to deify him. I don't know. Just seems like too much of a parallel to me.
It is quite the parallel. And if you're just tuning in, we're talking to Dr. Rita Louise. She is a best-selling author and the host of Just Energy Radio and the founder of the Institute of Applied Energetics. If I can just skew off for just a moment, where does your sense of energy and the root energy that is a part of healing, where does that connect to these godlike beings? Are they tapping into some sort of field of energy? Are they just more advanced than us because they can tap into something else that we just can't yet?
Good question. When you read the mythological record, it doesn't really claim that they had any kind of supernatural abilities. Short of perhaps shape-shifting, but not all of the gods could shapeshift. That was more tied to the fertility gods or the trickster gods, which are fertility gods, which might have been just a characteristic of their race. I don't know. But when you look at the stories, it's like they had technology. They had these ships that they flew around in. And they had, so in Celtic mythology, it talks about Freya. And she had a ring that she would put on, and not a ring. She had a cloak of feathers that she would put on, and it allowed her to soar through the skies. And you find a similar storyline in the Swan Maiden legends, where there were these swan maidens that lived in the sky, and they would come down to the earth and bathe. And so one day, this guy sees them bathing in the lake and steals one of the cloaks from the swan maidens, who's no longer able to return to her home in the sky. And so she lives with him for years and has children. And then one day she finds out where he hid her cloak, puts it back on, and returns to the sky. Yeah, so so it's not about they necessarily had these special skills. It's just that they had better technology.
And, I understand the metaphor for the Star Trek metaphor, whereas, there's the Prime Directive and you don't interfere, and that's why we don't see them. But if that were true now, why wasn't it true in the past?
Well, it's interesting. That's a great question. But I think that was one of the points of contention. If you start paying attention to the stories, what you find is that it is that group. So I have 4 different groups. Well, there's the All-Father, who you don't really see. There is the Sky Gods. There's the fertility gods, who are associated with water. There's the god of the underworld, who's associated with Tartarus or hell, but deep within the earth. And then there's a group that is, they have multiple descriptions. Sometimes they're called the giants, sometimes they're called dwarfs, but they are the gods who develop the technology, okay? And in some cultures, they're not even considered gods. And so we have these 4 groups. And so if you look at mythology, it seems like the character or characters who are tied to that fertility group, who were the ones that actually engineered humanity, were the ones that supported humanity. They're the ones that gave us information. I mean, if you recall in the Sumerian story, it was Enki who warned Xanthus that the flood was coming and told him to build a boat. Read wall, listen to what I have to say. So he didn't really talk to him directly, but he got the message. And so that god, the god like Enki, went against the wish of the Council of Gods or the Sky God, and so was always given like this, but they were identified as being tricksters or somehow bad, which gives them that bad representation in many cultures today.
And
I'm not sure I answered the question, but
well, kind of. But no, you did. I mean, I can understand there would be a contradiction of opinions if you have, totally different cultures coming to this earth and trying to decide how to manage dealing with this planet and the people on it.
But your question was about the Prime Directive, and so
right,
those fertility gods didn't really follow it. But what it feels like is that, well, if you're David Icke, they had an agenda, okay? Which I'm still working on that one. But it
You're working
appears
on
like
what
they
the
were
agenda
always...
is.
Huh?
You're working on what the agenda is what you're inferring?
Yeah, I mean, that's the big question. That's the big question. Were they here to teach humanity and support the development of humanity so that they can suck the energy off of us and suck the fear off of us, which is kind of what David Icke suggests, or were there other reasons? But it does seem like this group of fertility gods are the ones that gave humanity an education and helped us to develop, which was against, apparently, well, I mean, you think of, in the book of Enoch, it talks about the sons of God teaching, women about perfumes and makeup and teaching them about metallurgy. And that was the cause of the flood, because of the defilement that they imposed against humanity, like we weren't supposed to learn anything, but they taught it to us. And that was their big sin.
That was their sin.
Ooh.
And then that got passed down to us, apparently. Punishment for sin against the gods.
That's pretty standard fare wherever you look on the planet. Divine retribution.
Right. So now that we are finally catching up as far as technology, I mean, I could only imagine, I don't know, we're maybe a few hundred years away, maybe 100 years away, by the time we're able to be really spacefaring people. The very fact that NASA has a small research division looking into warp drive, even though they kind of play it down, they're still funding it. So that tells you something. And I think with the faster and faster we learn about the physics of this universe, the closer and closer looks that we too will be able to go out there and explore other planets. And so what happens then? What happens in 175 years from now? When we go out there and it's like, okay, game on. Do they step in? Do they quarantine us in the solar system now? Will we finally all just see them for who they are?
I mean, I don't know, but if you're a Trekkie, once humanity developed warp capabilities, they were, that's when the Vulcans landed on the Earth.
They came down, right?
And they came down and said, "Hey, we're here," But that was kind of like the line, They had to have warp capability. But if you think in other areas, I mean, think about the area of genetic research. I mean, I remember seeing this article actually a number of years ago about frankenfish. I love it, frankenfish. It was a salmon that was cloned with an eel, and I don't remember what the properties were, why they did it. But there are so many things that we're mixing stuff together in order to have a better result. Now, we don't really know what the implications are of taking an eel and a salmon. What if it gets more eel characteristics and it becomes violent? We don't know.
Yeah.
But we're developing the technology, in that one area where if we went to another planet and we wanted to develop a species there, we would have the technology to do that.
Yeah, I believe that. I'm sure you're familiar with the news that had come out in the past year about the CRISPR technology, where they can literally go in now and manipulate genes, in real time. So I don't think we're that far away before our astronauts can be genetically manipulated, not genetically grown, but just a regular human being who's now in their 20s, 30s, ready to go out to space. And just say, okay, we're going to do some modifications here so that you are better equipped to handle long-term space travel.
Yeah. I agree.
Yeah. And then of course it leads down that road of what, are you still human? So from a human,
I have to tell you, it's like I love Star Trek because it gives you so many great examples that you can throw into this what if scenario. Then you have someone like Khan, who was genetically engineered, but now he has no purpose, and they put him and his people on a ship and send him off into space and deep freeze because he has no place on the Earth anymore. So is that going to be what we do with our mistakes? Just send them off, get rid of them?
Well, I love that storyline, and nostalgically, I really do love the original episode and the movie Star Trek 2. But I rewatched the movie just recently because Star Trek 2 is supposed to be one of the best sci-fi films of all time. And
really?
Yeah, I don't agree with that.
Yeah, I don't either.
For its time, it was good. But it didn't. Yeah, I don't think it holds up. What do you think about the new Star Trek films? I mean, because what made the original Star Trek and Generations, Deep Space Nine, all of those iterations of Star Trek great were the real conscious effort to introduce philosophy into every aspect of life, especially science and exploration, but psychology, spirituality, politics. Do you feel like the new iterations of the Star Trek movies carry that torch well enough, or do you think that they're just more action-packed?
Oh, I definitely think they're more action-packed, with good special effects and, an okay storyline. I think Gene Roddenberry would be a little disappointed. I don't think he would turn over in his grave, but I think he would be a little disappointed that message of hope and a bright future and advancing technology. I mean, it's interesting because we are still looking to achieve the things that Star Trek showed us. But now we have cell phones, little flip phones, kind of like they had. I mean, we're still, there are so many things that come out of science that, the words were made up for Star Trek. Time, space continuum. And, I have tons of Star Trek examples because people can wrap their mind around it because they've seen all the episodes at least 20 times,
Right. I'm glad that other people have been introduced into the Star Trek lexicon that, perhaps would not have been in that whole universe. But, there's something to be said about using intelligence, smart people with different strengths and attributes working together. Of course, there was always the action element to Star Trek. That was sort of the entertainment, the fun of it as well. But it was people putting their minds together, smart people coming up with really clever ideas to find themselves, find a way out of really tricky situations. I think that humanity is going to be really forced to do so if we are encountered with, our version of the Vulcans coming down and saying, okay, guys, we need to really talk here and work it out. I don't think that we're going to have War of the Worlds radio broadcast suicides. There might be, but I don't think it's going to be some crazy mass, attempt for people to end their lives because of aliens coming down to Earth. But if that happens, we're going to need really smart people and creative thinkers to get through that transition, right? We can't just have, throw fists first and think later.
Oh, I agree. I don't totally agree. One thing that I've always made the comment about, because if a ship came and landed somewhere, most world governments would want to send the president or somebody like that, to go do this interaction. And I'm just like, maybe send the Dalai Lama. He'd be cool.
Yeah.
Maybe Jimmy Carter. He'd be kind of mellow. Someone that's, and then if they get blown up, which is awful to say, okay, then maybe you send a stronger hand in there. But someone who's going to sit there and talk to these people and find common ground.
Right. Someone who doesn't have ulterior motives. They have a clear motive that is recognized, and they reflect and meditate and think on these things carefully. I think you would have to be careful. You can't just throw caution to the wind should that day come.
Or go in with the attitude that they're here to hurt us. I mean, if they were here to hurt us, then they would just hurt us. They wouldn't come and land. And you made the comment about you don't think people would commit suicide or do anything like that, like in the 30s. And I think that our society has been very acculturated. I think that's the right word. To the notion of extraterrestrials and UFOs. And even though it might kind of freak people out a little bit, I don't think there would be bedlam because we've all seen movies and TV shows, and it's part of the mass culture now. It's part of our heritage now. Where I think people just wouldn't really be shocked.
If you were chosen to be the ambassador, what would be the first thing you would say to these aliens? Hey.
Hey, I brought some banana bread. Want a cup of coffee? No.
Though? Actually, that might be the best thing. Just, what? Come on, let's just chill out, sit down, and we'll see where the conversation takes us. No, but seriously, where, if you were the person to make that first contact, what would your first paragraph be to that person? What would your rap be?
Oh God, man, I would have to meditate on that for weeks, or at least a little bit. Not like right now. No, I mean, I think I would like kind of go with the whole chill idea, you know, when you sit there and you look at contemporary ufology, especially the experiencers, the people that have experienced some kind of abduction scenario, they talk about how these extraterrestrials communicate telepathically. And I think if you go in there with bad mojo, with your bad energy, thinking, well, I'm going to have to get rid of these people, or just, what I mean with bad energy, versus you go in there with good energy, they're going to receive that. They're going to receive that telepathically, that you're not there to hurt them. You're not there to create harm. And so they'll receive you as opposed to resist you. So maybe it's really not something that you talk about. Maybe it's something that it's more of a feeling exchange that happens.
Right. So then that would imply
unless they
that
speak English. Yeah.
Well, whatever. Well, my guess would be, honestly, if we were being watched for quite a long time, maybe not all of these species or everyone in these species speaks English, but my guess would be there would be someone who understands it, their version of an ambassador, interpreter, and not just English, but probably every other language, because they've had thousands of years, right? I mean,
this is true,
to study us, yeah. And it's got to be frustrating from them if they know our history better than we do. And that, I think, would be a mind-blowing revelation to find out what they know about us. Were it true that they've been around for 70,000 years, who knows? If they've been keeping records and track of us, we might just get our minds blown of what our real history is. And the full breadth
I agree.
Of it. Mm-hmm.
Well, one of the things that I point out in my E.T. Chronicles book, which I actually talk about in a little bit more depth in my new book, which the working title is called Being Human, is just the notion of the mythic narrative. Based on the point of view of the writer, we find two very different focus points. There are stories that are from the flood. Okay, so I'm going to use biblical. So from the beginning to the flood, and then once we pass the flood, and kind of like the story of the Tower of Babel, where we all have our own different languages. Once you pass that point in time, you move into stories. All right, so the early ones are the gods talking about the gods. Okay, and so, Kronos castrates Uranus. It's okay. There's no horror. There's no shock. It's kind of like we were there and we were watching, some kind of fight going on between our friends down the street. We're just like rooting on. They were part of the action. They were part of the story. But when you pass that point, the flood, and the development of culture as we know it, the stories change, and it's no longer the stories of the gods about the gods. It's the story of humanity and our interaction, one with each other, and our interaction with the gods. Where we're praying to the gods, or the gods intervene on some level. My favorite, Jason and the Argonauts, my favorite movie.
Let's hold it right there, Jason and the Argonauts. We will pick it up from there after this last and final break. I'm speaking to Dr. Rita Louise, a best-selling author and amazing person with a breadth of knowledge. Hang in there. We will be right back. Welcome back to Paranormal Now. This is Alan B. Smith, your host on the Inception Radio Network. And taking us out of the break was Route 66 by the Manhattan Transfer. Dr. Rita Louise, have you ever taken Route 66?
I have been on some parts of it. I haven't done just, a road trip on it. But I think that would be so cool to do. So one day, maybe I'll put it on my bucket list.
Yeah, we, in our... multiple road trips out to the Midwest. there were a couple times we hit 66, and just really something romantic about it. Owing to the history and also the sightings. I mean, the highways out there, these big, long, open highways, particularly 66, because it is no longer the main highway. The lights are low and the skies are big and bright, and you can see quite a bit out there. Have you ever had the chance to go on a road trip and, search the sky for stars for UFOs or just to take in the beauty?
Not necessarily on a road trip, but obviously I've had experiences of just being out. I have some ex-relatives that lived on a ranch in New Mexico, and we would visit them all the time and just, sit out on the porch, and just look at the stars and stuff like that. Very cool stuff.
Oh,
I've never seen a UFO.
Oh, really? All right. Isn't that funny?
Ghosts, all kinds of other weird stuff, but no UFO.
Yeah. It's funny how there's some people who will, think on these things, look towards the skies and never see one, and then you have someone who could care less, has a complete and utter close encounter. I've seen one when I was much younger, and that sort of put me on this path for the rest of my life of being mildly obsessed with it. But I think that makes it more interesting from my perspective, how you have come to accept that these gods, aka extraterrestrials, exist, have come, are visiting now, without having seen a UFO yourself. Because the defense a lot of people use when they're researching these subjects, they'll say, well, yeah, blah blah blah, history and this and that and facts, but all that aside, I saw it with my own eyes. So you can tell me what you want, but I know I saw it, and I know that it's real. But in your case, you really are relying on your research and the evidence that you draw on.
And there was no way to get around it. There was just anyone with common sense. Earlier I was talking about how researchers, just say, well, we can't really explain it. How we had this miraculous event happen in wheat. We can't explain it. But if you get rid of the miracles that happened in antiquity and put alien in there, it makes a whole lot more sense. And you read these ancient narratives, and today we have technology, and we can look at these stories and recognize the technology that they had. I mean, we might not have the technology, but we can recognize it as technology. And so by the time I got doing my research, there was no way for me to get around it other than saying it was a miracle. It was a miracle. It was a miracle. I'll give another example. So between the time of, so I have to put my little thinking cap on. So we had Australopithecus, who were the first upright walking hominids, who they have just recently found, yet another miracle, that they started walking upright. Oh, and they started fashioning stone tools too.
Australopithecus.
So it wasn't even the Homo habilis, which was the first of the Homo line, to use stone tools. But what they can't figure out is evolution takes millions of years to occur. I mean, that's what they drum into you. Well, what they can't figure out is how in less than 2 million years, this huge number of changes happened in the hominid line. They can't explain it because the acceleration was so rapid. It's like, well, but if you're genetically splicing genes, in which they talk about in the mythic record, then maybe it is possible to take something that is pretty ape-like and transform it into something that is man-like with culture. And
so something with some intelligence, but adding to it.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. But if you think about it, chimpanzees have intelligence. We have taught apes how to do sign language. And one of the things at the Stone Age Research Center. They have taught a couple of apes to actually how to make stone tools. Took them 10 years, but they taught them how to make stone tools. And this is my favorite. There's this one ape called Lulis who learned how to make fires. And so he would take sticks and he would pile them up. And now, granted that they gave him a lighter, but he still had to get the sticks and pile them up in a certain way, and with his lighter would light these fires and get them burning, and then he would cook marshmallows over it.
Really? Cook marshmallows over it?
Cook marshmallows, yeah. I watched the video, and it's like, cool, he's making marshmallows.
Well, I hope they have a good dentist for this guy. Jeez.
But he was taught how to do that. And so one of the things that I contend in this book that I'm working on is that, the gods taught us how to do stuff. I mean, you read, the gods gave us agriculture. They gave us writing. They gave us fire. They gave us everything. And so if you look at humanity, when I say we're stupid, it's because it doesn't say we really invented anything until after 2500 BC. Mm-hmm. And then it was a long time from that point in time till we really made any kind of progress.
Well, that's what I think is the most. That to me, that is one of the most strange unoccurrences in history, because why didn't the period of the Greeks, or the Romans, or the Chinese early on when they, were creating, fireworks, and they had these sort of like bursts of engineering occur? Why didn't that happen 10,000 years ago, 15,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago? Because if we were the same intelligence all along, why didn't we have these bursts of technological advancements occur and none of them sustained? Why did it take up until recent times to get to the point where, you can't stop technology now? It's plowing along almost of its own accord with its own momentum. Why do you think human beings were so slow to get to where we are now? I mean, there's no intervention there, is there?
Well, I mean, and I don't have the material in front of me, but there were a number of genetic changes that happened in the human lineage that started. So we became bipedal, and then the next major change happened to the FOXP2 gene, and I know this one because I've been writing about it, which is associated with communication primarily. It's associated with other things, but that's where the biggest tie is. And it's interesting because they say that the change to the FOXP2 gene happened 200,000 years ago. And then they turn around and say, well, Neanderthals also had the same version of the FOXP2 gene. So did the FOXP2 gene develop independently in these two, species? Or did the ancestor to these two species have the updated FOXP2 gene? Mm-hmm.
And passed it down.
And then passed it down. But then there were other genes changes that happened that increased the size of the frontal cortex. There was another gene that coincides with the creative explosion. I mean, there was another gene chain, the ASPM gene, that was modified about 5,000 BC, or they find the first instance of it about 5,000 BC. And they don't really have information about what it does, but I think it's pretty convenient that they found the spread of it around 5,000 BC, right with the advent of civilization.
So there is a trackable genetic or scientific history to recent evolution.
Correct. And technological. It's interesting because I was talking about the timeline thing, and so I look for these bumps, so there was a bump about, all right, I have to think here a second. So it was with like Australopithecus, they became upright, their first tool users. So that's our first marker. But then about 300,000 years ago, we started using ochre. Whether they're using it for paint or whatnot, not really sure. But there were some other technological advances. We found the first piece of etching. So they think it's like the very first piece of art. So then there's really kind of not a whole lot going on. But then 100,000 years ago, we have this another huge burst. Oh, the first intentional burials, 350,000 years ago. 350,000 years ago.
Yeah,
with a species that wasn't Homo erectus or Neanderthal.
It wasn't.
That's a really recent study.
It wasn't Denisovan, was it?
No, this was in Africa, and it was Homo needs holy, something like that. And these were primitive, but what they found were the remains of a number of virtually intact hominids in this cave that they were like, you had to trek through this thing. Cavers found it, and they eliminated the possibility that the bones were brought in by animals. They eliminated the possibility that it was brought in by wash water, because when they did the excavation, I mean, there's a picture of a hand, the hand bone, and it's the bones were all in the right place, like as if they just removed the skin. And so based on that, they're like, we think that they brought these bodies here. And then after that, like a year or 2 years after that, they actually found a second cave that also had the bodies of more of these creatures. Moving forward in time, the next burial that we have a record for is 100,000 years ago, which is where we have our next bump in cognition.
Well, and also, I think it's fair to say that there's, graves and works that have yet to be uncovered. So, exactly. Maybe we'll find something that's 200,000 or 175,000 years and so forth. And so, but how do you reconcile that with, if the idea is that some other races manipulated genetically the human race? Doesn't this variation of genetics and evolution and branching off of the same, hominid family sort of undermine that a little bit? Because we can see that there's genetic variety and over different periods of time with different races here on this earth. So, how do we know at what point did some extraterrestrials come down and intervene?
Well, my contention is that they've been here all along, and they have been intervening with the entire history of the planet.
So I wonder if they had a role to play in Neanderthals or Denisovans or...
Well, what about dinosaurs? What about trilobites? I mean, how did we go from being sponges and amoebas and little fishy, planty-looking fish things, to having eyes? Where did that come from? They're like, oh, well, they developed proto-eyes and, the sun made them develop. Come on. I mean, it's like you have to make this whole long explanation, or they were engineered, because the way that they come on into existence is kind of miraculous, which they can't explain. Yes, another one of those, they can't explain things.
Well, I mean, there will always be some gaps in science, or at least for a very long time, for sure. So are you thinking in terms of progenitors in the Alien, the movie sense, whereas this other species kind of goes around and manipulates and helps to create life? Or, how common is life to start up on its own then? On different planets.
I mean, I am really a proponent of the panspermia concept, or the directed panspermia concept. And I feel like there has been an ongoing history of extraterrestrial life here on Earth. They didn't live on the surface because I don't think that they were necessarily compatible with living on the surface of the Earth, which was one of the reasons why they created life on the surface of the Earth, because they couldn't live on it.
Maybe, so. Yeah. I think that, if life is not so common, then maybe that one species that did make it to an advanced level of intelligence, could be doing that in order to help the rest of the universe, blossom in intelligence. But I don't know. I kind of feel like we're gonna look at Titan and these different moons around Saturn and find that there is life there. Maybe we'll find life on in a methane ocean. I mean, I'm hoping that's the case. If not, then it does make this sort of progenitor directed panspermia theory look more appealing. Because if we look at our solar system and we don't find life growing in different environments, then I think that would tell us a lot, and I think that would support what you actually just said, that there are these random bursts of evolution, and there is some difficulty in explaining it.
It becomes, once you start taking all of the information and start putting it side by side, it becomes kind of blatantly obvious, but no one really looks at it that way. And, like, I'm friends with Dr. Sam Osminagosh. I always say his name wrong, the Bosnian pyramid guy. Mm-hmm. And, and they had found a stick or a leaf, some kind of organic matter that was sitting on top of the surface of the pyramid. And then they had it carbon dated through multiple places, blah, blah, blah. So this was, debris that ended up on top of the pyramid that was buried under a bunch of dirt. And it was dated to 2800 BC, something like that. And everyone sits there and goes, oh, no, it can't be a pyramid. It definitely can't be that old. And, and there are all of these doubters out there. But once you start taking this material and start putting it side by side with what they find in different areas, I'm really good at synthesizing multiple pieces and going, well, look, we have this here, we have this here, we have this here. What is it saying? I think, I don't know, in my opinion, it just becomes very obvious.
So at the end of the day, do you think that evolution can occur on its own to form life in the first place? I mean, I'm assuming yes, right?
No.
No, even if there's these other godlike beings.
But they didn't evolve life, they brought life.
Right, but for them, I mean, within the confines of the universe, then it must be possible for somewhere.
Is outside of my pay grade. Trying to describe the nature of the originator, God, source, whatever word you want to put, the big G God, outside my pay grade. Where the extraterrestrials came from, I maybe could make some commentary about, but how they got into being, we don't even know how old this universe is. They say that it's 13 billion years old, but that's only how far we can look back in time. So it can't be infinite and be 13 billion years old. And so I think, go ahead.
Well, when you're looking at the totality of these different gods and extraterrestrials that you've researched, is there any one group of gods or one type of a described god that stands out the most to be the leader of these different races coming down here, the one that's sort of leading the pack now?
Well, I mean, that at this point in time would be the sky god, the god that lives in heaven, the guy with the white skin and long flowing hair that everybody on the planet knows about because he's the guy in charge right now. And, has the name of Zeus or Indra or, whatever name,
Yahweh.
Yeah. So he's the guy who has control of the planet right now.
Right, interesting. So were it different then, and some other, assuming this is all real, right? Some other god was in charge, then religions would be different to this day because they're based on an actual alien figure. Let's just say it wasn't the Indra god, or this. Let's say it was a female goddess, in charge of all of these other, alien races that have come down here, then our religions would be quite different, wouldn't they?
Oh, exactly. But, that's the part a lot of people don't get. It's like, why in every culture on the planet, sans maybe some Australian cultures, have their supreme god being the guy who lives in heaven? And they go, oh, well, it's tied to the sun. It's like, no. That's because that's where his mothership happens to be. Why can't there be a female god? Why does this sky god who lives in heaven have a lightning bolt as his weapon? Why is he continually described as having white skin and long flowing hair? It's beyond coincidence.
Well, and if, we're going with your theory here, then perhaps that would explain why thousands of years ago it was a woman that was the head of the religious sects and belief systems and ways of worshiping, and that power, the position, that seat of power switched. It changed hands, and that's why we have the religions that we have now. But then, if you're in the Middle East a couple thousand years ago, did they really imagine Yahweh as, a light-skinned, long hair, blonde guy? I mean, or they probably imagined him more like themselves, right?
Well, actually, there are images. They were like cylinder seals with, which I, of course, had to include because they were blasphemous, that had a picture of Yahweh, except he had serpent feet.
Yeah.
Ooh. Have you ever seen that? I'm like...
I have.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you said it was on a like a Roman coin or maybe it was
like
pre-Roman.
That. Yeah.
Yeah. And depicted
I don't
Yahweh.
remember off the top, But
yeah, because back when many gods were depicted with the lower portions of their body as being serpentine or snake-like, and it was not considered evil at the time. Yeah, that's fascinating. Of course, now the story of Adam and Eve demonizes the serpent. Do you think that that story is an actual story, and that the serpent was some alien race who said, no, I think that these human beings deserve to know this and this and this, and then the other alien's like, nope, I'm sorry, we're not going to do that, I'm in charge now?
There are, I'm going to say, bits and pieces that are included in that story. I mean, again, it was these half man, half serpent, reptilian-y gods that were the ones that educated humanity. They're the ones that formed humanity. But the story of eating fruit or eating the food of the gods is actually a fairly consistent narrative that you find. There's a couple that associated with apples, but not so much. In China, there is the peach of immortality, and every 3,000 years, the peach tree would bloom and produce fruit, and the gods would have to partake of the peach ceremony or peach festival or whatever it was, and eat of this peach to maintain their immortality. We have stories. There's the story of Adapa, who was Enki's mortal son, or half man. He didn't have any divine powers. And Anu wanted him to go up to the heavens to see him. And Enki tells him, if he offers you something to eat, don't eat it. If he offers you something to drink, don't drink it, because it'll kill you or you'll die. You're going to die. And so he goes up there and they offer him something to drink and they offer him something to eat. And he turns them down. And as he's getting ready to leave, Anu says, well, you turn down, the food and the drink, and that would have given you immortality. So we have the tree of knowledge and the tree of life, and so you don't really find stories that talk about the tree of knowledge, but you do find a number of stories that talk about some kind of consumption and a tie to immortality.
And tonight you have given us quite the fruit of knowledge. Dr. Rita Louise, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. I'm sorry we have to wrap this up because we're coming to the end. But if you want to find out more about Dr. Rita Louise, go to her website, soulhealer.com. And Rita, is there any other place that you want them to go to and check you out on social media?
They can friend me or like me, because I'm running out of friends. Like me on Facebook, Dr. Rita Louise. So it's Dr. Rita Louise on Facebook. And just one last little thing. I've been doing these weekly planetary vibration readings that I post on Facebook and on YouTube every week. I've been getting a lot of very nice comments. They're also on my website, soulhealer.com. That's really where people should go first, because that's kind of the portal to everything Dr. Rita.
All right, that's it. This is Alan B. Smith for Paranormal Now on the Inception Radio Network. You can follow me on Instagram at Paranormal Now, or go to our Facebook page at Paranormal Now Radio. And I want to thank Bob Tarmac, Joe Champion, and MJ Lucas for making this show possible, and also a shout out to Ken Cherry from Epic Voyages Radio, who helped me get my start in this fun and exciting field. All right, to everybody out there, thank you for tuning in again. And in the meantime, let the mystery take you. Be well.
Mark Slade Investigates the Stephenville UFO. Written by renowned UFO investigator Ken Cherry, the Stephenville UFO tells the story of the infamous UFO sightings of Stephenville, Texas in 2008, where local residents witnessed unknown craft and lights in the sky chased by military planes. These sightings would set off a series of events that would quickly become one of the most controversial and well-documented UFO cases in U.S. history. Mark Slade Investigates the Stephenville UFO is a fascinating and frightening tale of sinister plots and shadow government agencies vying for control of the nation. Author and researcher Ken Cherry has woven an intricate tale that shines a light on an ominous chapter of American history and proving that not everything is as it seems. Mark Slade Investigates the Stephenville UFO is now available on Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, and on Glanatide.com.